My core critique around the net zero is that it's too singularly focused on one thing, which is only part of the whole picture. And actually, when you look, it's a simplification, which is good to get started. All you need when you're a long way away is a long range target and direction. You only have to worry about the harbour walls when you're just outside the harbour, not when you're 5 miles away. So, there is an appropriateness to sort of think about that long term goal. But as you get closer, as you start momentum towards it, to actually be more granular and more thoughtful about the way that you apply it.
I'm Aoife Devitt, and welcome to the 50 Faces podcast, a podcast committed to revealing the richness and diversity of the world of investment by focusing on its people and their stories. I'm joined today by Nick Spencer, who's a senior consultant and sustainability risk specialist in the Milliman Life and Financial Services practice based in London. Nick and I did a podcast series together back in 2021 when we both discussed biodiversity. At that time, he was in his own firm, Gordian Advisors, and I was at Federated Hermes. So we both moved on since then. He's still a fellow of the Institute in the Faculty of Actuaries and past chair of its sustainability board and a past council member. He's written extensively on the integration of climate risks into actuarial work, as well as on natural capital, biodiversity, and broadly on aspects of the climate transition. So a whole lot to cover here. Welcome back, Nick. Thanks for joining me in this forum.
Thanks, Evan. It's good to be back again, although feeling slightly strange at the moment, just being in a different chair and being the interviewee rather than the host.
I know, but we had some good fun together on that biodiversity podcast, all of the themes of which are still relevant today, I would note. So I will refer the readers to it in the show notes. Well, we didn't discuss your background on that podcast, however. It was strictly a subject-focused one. So you've had a long career. Can you give us a quick snapshot of how you went from being an actuary into this newer, I suppose, newer for you, but not necessarily new in years terms, focus on sustainability and its relevance for actuaries?
Yes, thank you, Evan. I think for me, it sort of started as a process and a journey. And sometimes I wonder why I didn't get started earlier. There have been parts along that journey as I moved from sort of pensions into investments, which scarily is almost 30 years ago. But why wasn't this picked up? And I think it came through in regards to, what could I do about it? Could I understand it? The starting point of this journey was often talking about ethics, and I still think we have a bit of overhang of that people confuse the financial import and the impact and the importance with a broader sort of perspective on just doing the right thing. But I think once that became tangible, and once we had the Paris Agreement and started by working with the Institute and Volunteer Party, looking at the impacts of climate change and what defined benefit pensions actuaries could do about it. And that really set me along this journey. And from there, being integrated more in terms of starting off in the ESG world, but actually now thinking more about sustainability, thinking about risk and the opportunities that can come from thinking about this.
That's really interesting that you frame it in terms of not doing it earlier. Would you say there were any early indicators? Ethics is a fascinating connection, that this was something that a whole career could be based on. And I'm talking, this is the question that usually starts with the surprising turns. But I'm wondering what it was that triggered it. And maybe you can talk about the segue into your own advisory business and now back into working with Milliman.
Yeah, and I think, again, that sort of surprising turns. I mean, if we look at the point in journey, also what's interesting about the past career, it includes firms like sort of Putnam Investments, where it was going through its own crisis. But actually that led them to adopt the sort of internal principles, which then went on to become the sort of PRI principles. But this back in 2003, the PRI principles are 2006, and that was part of its redemption journey at the time. So in one respects, I've been working on this since then. I think it's fair to say it's not clear how much of that was embedded into the culture at the time. But I think for me, it also started when I started thinking about long-term and sustainability investors. So investors at Neuberger Berman, which actually operated for family offices, often had 10, 20 stock portfolios and thought about their returns from an absolute return and sustainability of their investment returns, and thus how they could build it. So in that way, the sort of sustainability actually started for me from a financial sense. And then you could see this as long-term trends, long-term aspects of investing that were going to be part of the mega trends of the future. So that's really where my starting journey came into this. And then I worked with Paul Udall at GAM, And from that, I attended a workshop or a seminar, in fact, when the Stern report was released, talking about climate change. And you could see actually at that point in time, both the necessity of reducing emissions, but also actually all the investment parts, the risks and the opportunities in terms of engaging in those long-term trends. So again, coming at this, really my first part of the journey into sustainability, which I think is common to many, actually started from that pure, hard, if you like, cold nose face about it in regards to it as a financial aspect.
And that's, I think, maybe where some people have come to that point, maybe having started maybe at more ideological points and realize that some of the traction, I think that's probably the zeitgeist right now, is that the traction of these strategies depends on their commercial applicability. And I'm really interested in your risk thread that has run through all of this, because that has been a thread I've seen that has often been the kind of key to threading the needle in terms of why these aspects matter. It's not about ideology or aspiration. It's about cold, hard risk, which is also very understandable to many. Can you talk us through that? And maybe just bringing the lens back with your, how do actuaries think about risk? And maybe how has risk had a thread that's gone through all of these?
All of these parts. Yeah, well, it's sort of, so at one level, actuaries sometimes describe themselves as sort of risk professionals in the terms of the thinking about how will the long term play and how do we navigate. You know, if you're looking at a pension fund or a life insurer, insurance companies, you need to sort of guarantee, you need to provide that benefit that maybe not only this year or the next year, but maybe 5, 10, 15, 20, 30, 40, 50 years out in the future. So actually risk and thinking about how do we navigate it, sustainability, the ability to offer that through enormous change. I mean, if we went back 30 years, most of us did not have internet. Most of us did not have email addresses, let alone smartphones and apps and the such like. So actually a pace of change we often do not recognize at the time, but we're talking about transformational change to the economy. The Magnificent Seven largely did not exist at that time. So we need to think about the future states of the world in that sense and what is the risk and how do we navigate it. So I think that then adds a sort of common thread to the actuarial sort of mindset in approaching this. And as we broaden this out to then, I think, building on that sort of themes and what started to sort of consider the megatrends, if you like, in terms of how is our future going to be governed, I actually start thinking about this in a systems perspective. And that's to say, what are sort of both the themes, but then what are the incentives and the controls that sit around it? And what are the other influences? So starting on that sort of climate focus, you suddenly realize that actually we're not going to solve and move forward in climate if we do not include the work, say, on biodiversity and nature, and if we do not take the people with us. You know, if we don't have societies backing for these changes, then they can't occur. So you start looking at this as a more complex problem in terms of how the whole system interacts, and actually the fact that we need to solve climate, nature, and people, creating a just outcome at the same time.
And you mentioned the word complex problem. And certainly people love a complex problem to get their teeth into intellectually. But for many, complex problems are daunting, off-putting, put in a box and said, okay, I'll think about that later, or I'll worry about that later. How do you break that complex problem down? Do you use risk models? Is it through language? How do we try to break it down so that it can be tackled by, say, companies wishing to do the right thing, or investors, or risk managers?
Yes, and it's interesting when you say some people are attracted and some people are cautious of complex problems. I remember when chairing the sustainability board, and I'd characterize half the people on the board were interested in sustainability because it threw up some really interesting and complex problems. And the other half were broader, coming from an ethics and engagement point of view, seeing actually the changes that were occurring, the impact on society, and wishing to think about how to engage in it. But it's interesting that sort of push-pull people have around complex problems. The way that we sort of start, and actually, the sort of foundation for me moving to Milliman and developing out some of the systems risk thinking tools that they have there, is what we need to do is sort of capture that complexity, but in a way that people can understand and engage with. So mathematically, I would describe that as a sort of a minimally complex map and a perspective. But all that is to look at how cause and effects happen and say, when we have an event, what happens next? So if we think about climate change, if we were to have, say, a flooding event in regards to the fields in the UK so that the food production went down, that's likely to lead to food inflation. So that would then cause food inflation and potential strains on the economy that we can then follow through into financial markets. So we look at that complexity, but we actually just work back and express it in terms of cause and effect. And actually, because we use clear narratives, I sort of try and avoid complication terms about what type of distributions or what type of statistics, which, to be honest, even actuaries can start glazing over in those discussions, but actually just talking about simple narratives and sort of causes and effects that will be very obvious to everyone, as it were, in the street and be able to talk about within business and to talk about it more in sort of engineering and construction terms rather than mathematical and theoretical terms.
And getting back to engineering and construction terms, I think those terms and quantifying damage are surely key to the risk assessment for, say, insurers. But how do you, I suppose, I'm sort of thinking that maybe the magnitude of damage could be quantified, but what probability do you attach to that and what kind of modeling, given there could be knock-on effects, do you do in terms of probabilities?
Yeah, so at one level, you can say, well, again, we have this sort of map. What we've done in that sort of minimize is really to simplify it. So what we're looking to do is where are the key plot lines rather than, out of a movie, we go from the sort of beginning to the end. And you can describe that in 3 sentences. That won't include all the car chases, the boat rides, all the sort of distractions that happen along the way, but you can still put the core part of the story. So the first thing is that we built is what is the core part of the story? What are the plot lines? And then for each level of the plot line, you can say, well, how likely is that? What connects sort of this event to that? So if we look at flooding, what's the probability of flooding? Then how wide an area can it be? How does that impact the food inflation? What is the sort of area to build? So we can then build that through a series of probabilities that are fairly simple, but again, we can multiply and add them together to think about how do we get to the overall picture and the overall outcome. So once we understand each step, and each step we've broken down into a very simple sort of A to B type area, we can then actually just link through a bit of maths in the background how these all connect together so we can then look at the overall probabilities and understand the overall outcomes in a similar way to, if you had 3 dice and you sort of throw them and you want to know what's the chance of getting 3 1s or what's the score of getting 9, we can actually look at the different ways in which that can build up and then just basically follow the maths through.
And it's interesting because obviously the major goal here is mitigation. Mitigating damage is not simply quantifying it. And we've seen some strategies emerge which focus, say, on flood damage mitigation or on putting in place measures so that the probability of flooding is minimized. And this is something that could be seen as a commercially viable project because of the effect that this would have on insurance. Those types of mitigants, how effective do you think they are in terms of strategies, given that they could make a difference to insurance? And do you think we're going to see more of them?
So let us say I hope so. And actually, I think that there is a lot of work going on to actually start looking at this and start integrating mitigating factors into insurance rating. So I know through my colleagues that are working actually out in California, where I think everyone will be aware they had very severe wildfires and there's a lot of wildfire risk there. Well, there are known sort of approaches that you can do in terms of forest management, managing the undergrowth, keeping clearances around houses, that actually if you maintain that standard, and you maintain that standard not only as an individual, but as a community in terms of a township or area, you can actually significantly mitigate both the sort of chances of wildfire and certainly the damage that it causes. And we're now looking at ways of quantifying actually the level at which that is undertaken, and then being able to embed that into insurance ratings and premiums. And I think in a similar fashion, we hope that sort of the flood and the flood changes can also occur in terms of making that change to the areas and the aspects. And again, there is an element of this is an art as much as it is a science. But I think once we've got that in there and a bit of leaning in by the insurers and the whole community, I would hope that we can sort of move into that rating area and actually get those reflected, that sort of effort reflected in the insurance prices. And I think this is part of the evolution that we will see with leading insurers going forward, is that sort of leaning into some of the changes in the adaptations and working out how to work with their policyholders and the sort of regions in which they're insuring to actually reduce the risk, which sort of reduces the premiums overall, retains the affordability of insurer. So there's a sort of win-win side to the whole equation.
And do you think that the focus on carbon and energy transition, which many institutional investors have taken, merits being front and center? I'm thinking some have taken a net zero focus and maybe some are moving towards more sustainability. Do you think that we're having the right conversation around what's relevant?
So when I started this journey, and this is depending on your timeline, you can take this from 2010 in terms of sort of that meeting in Stern when the Stern report had just come out, or, my work with Actuaries started in sort of 2015, in particular, that working party. We started with climate. That was the key area. That had been the sort of core part. The energy element was the clear and first part in regards to tackling climate change. So it was the first and will always be a core plank of this. But I think as we go forward, we sort of see that there's a broader and more interconnecting factors that we need to take on. Having started on the decarbonisation, and we should celebrate the amount that we've terms of invested in renewables, that though emissions haven't come down, we have, at least in the sort of number of economies, started to break the link between emissions and the economy in terms of growth, and actually starting to see our pathway forward. But as we move into the next phases, that alone won't be enough. So nature, as again a sort of example, can be both a source or a sink of carbon. If we have forest fires, last year we lost, I think, I was reading this morning, a record amount in terms of forestry was lost last year. When that goes up literally in smoke, that is creating emissions, that is adding to the total emissions. If we grow forestry, if we increase the amount of carbon and wildlife that's in there, we are actually capturing carbon. So we're actually reducing the amount of emissions. So nature has an each way role depending on how we approach it. It is impacted by climate change. It can be a mitigant against climate change. So we need to think about our relationship with nature if we're actually going to go onto this journey of net zero. And I think the second parts of the net zero, again, I think this was a good motivation for Get Started. It gave a clear goal. It was actually on the basis of this is possible. We can actually have the maths, and this is where net zero, I've got a different story if you want, of where I saw it emerge in 2019, but we can actually do it. And that was really the message, and that was helping to spark action. I think, again, as we move into the next phase, we need to both see net zero in a more sophisticated fashion, that actually different economies, different industries, different areas can get to the net zero at different paces. We need to actually embrace that. We need to actually show some leadership and move forward, but actually understand that the timeline of getting there will be different depending on the industry, depending on the country, depending on the starting point in terms of get there. What actually matters is that we reduce as much as possible, as fast as possible. And actually, as we're already breaking through the 1.5 degrees and well on the way to 2 degrees or potentially more, we actually need to think about not only getting to net zero, we will need to go past net zero. Indeed, most of the pathways already had presumed this in terms of sort of coming back afterwards, that we'll have to get into negative emissions rather than just net zero emissions. So actually our goal should be starting thinking not only about net zero, but beyond net zero. How do we actually restabilize a climate that is already overheated in terms of the stability that it will be good for us all?
That's fascinating, because I don't think that investors had a clear idea as to what their path to net zero would be, given some of the net part, that getting to whether it's just offsetting the impact, the positive impact that was impossible to eradicate. How could they get beyond net zero? Do you have any sense as to what can help on the other half of that ledger?
One of the challenges about this term net zero is net zero to whom? And at a certain level, it makes sense as a sovereign entity if you actually have an oversight over a country. And really, we're talking about net zero as the world, to really be thinking about the accounting in that sense. When we're looking down at individual activities and individual parts of the economy, it is less clear on how that sort of what that net zero means. What is the offset? Do we expect everyone, I think there's a recent example in terms of, I have a trade deficit with my barber because I only ever get there and cut my hair, and, he never buys any of my investment and risk services. So I've got a trade deficit with my barber. But if I actually sort of think about that, that's how our economy works. It's sort of very interconnected and complex, and different parts of the economy focus on different things. So if we have nature restoration, if we have broader areas in which we're bringing down, actually what we should be looking at is the goal of how do we reduce the emissions as fast as possible? And are the elements of our portfolio bringing those emissions down at the fastest rate relative to peers, relative to what to know? And therefore we can think about, do we invest in the leaders or do we invest in the laggards, on where the laggards are actually acting to catch up and therefore may have more decarbonisation turn within them, which may actually represent an investment opportunity to support that change. So again, it's about thinking about how does this operate overall? And given that actually our portfolio is only ever a slice of the globe, what's actually our duty within that slice, and what's the maximum that we can achieve given the activities that is undertaking?
I love that very pragmatic way of thinking. And now, I mean, it's interesting that you started with your discussion on ethics and how this was your path into thinking around sustainability, because my experience of ethics is that there's usually a code of ethics that's expected of industry participants, and they're taught it at the beginning. But in order to be truly reinforced, there needs to be ongoing training, ongoing reminders. And I would think the same is perhaps the case for sustainability thinking, training, so sort of continuous improvement. If you could get your crystal ball out now in terms of where we will be in 5 years in this thinking, you've seen some evolution. I don't know if it's helpful here to just sort of trace the evolution of some of the thinking up to this point, but how do you think we will be approaching the system in 5 years? Will we see it more as a system as you do now? Will that be more commonplace? And do you think there will be more integration of, beyond the carbon and energy transition focus?
So hopefully yes to all the above. So if you like, you can say that my core critique around the net zero is that it's too singularly focused on one thing, which is only part of the whole picture. And actually, when you look, it's a simplification, which is good to get started. All you need when you're a long way away is a long range target and direction. You only have to worry about the harbour walls when you're just outside the harbour, not when you're 5 miles away. So, there is an appropriateness to sort of think about that long-term goal. But as you get closer, as you start momentum towards it, to actually be more granular and more thoughtful about the way that you apply it. So, I mean, whether we will get there in 5 years or whether it will take a little longer, I think I do try and take that caveat to be careful about forecasts, particularly about the future. But where I would hope we could get to is a more sophisticated, broader systems view of the challenges ahead, and actually accept that actually if we want to achieve things, it's not just enough to transform the energy system. That's a necessary part, but it itself won't be enough. And we need to take a broader view that embraces the complexity. And again, you might say, well, how do we do that? Well, I think, again, we look at the slice that we own, we look at the objectives that we're looking to achieve, and then we step back through the influences. So starting with our goals, which may be securing a long-term future for our pensioners. We then step back and say, well, what will actually guarantee that? Well, we need to get a certain amount of investment return. We need to protect them from the downsides to those risks. Where are those downsides of the risk coming from? How does the fact that sort of the way that we're positioned in regards to climate affect those goals and those outcomes? And it's also to be a little more granular in terms, again, the sort of complaints can be, well, doesn't that mean that we need to eliminate fossil fuels? If we eliminated all the fossil fuels, the lights won't go on tomorrow. But what we need to think about, how do we position ourselves and invest in the future that enables us to have the lights on over the next 5 years, but actually envisage a future in which we're no longer burning things to make that power and energy, but actually using light, we're using wind, we're using other forms of renewables to create that. And let's invest in that future and see, again, this as a system of interdependence and connections in terms of how we achieve it.
And this is usually when I go to the reflections and I ask about key people across your career. But I'm going to ask you, maybe we can have this in the show notes. I'm sure there's a great amount of reading that you've done and recommend, and maybe some people that you suggest our listeners could follow in terms of people you think are getting the thinking right on this. So, but just in terms of any mentors or people whose work you admire or who have had an influence on you in this area or in life in general? Anyone you can mention there?
Yes, I mean, there's such a long list of people that put into. One, in terms of having a broader perspective on our economy and life, I think I'd probably go for the Dasgupta report on the economics of sort of biodiversity. And that shows that, in fact, all of our system and our economy is built off of nature. I mean, from a classical economics point of view, they will tell you the agricultural sector is worth 3%. And maybe they'll add 2% on for sort of water and utilities. But just how much of that economy could exist if we didn't have food and water? And I would argue none of it. So is it 3 and 4%, or is it 100%? And I think we need to sort of think about different ways, more about how does layers up and those foundations support the upper buildings, rather than just this is a small piece of the pie. But that would be one of the starting points. In terms of people, and I think through my career, I mean, I can talk through too many names that I think to sort of rattle off here. But I think what I've looked to do through my career is find sort of partners and leaders and understand how they approach problems. And I still go back, I still started off in an actuarial practice. And when I faced a client problem, I actually lean in to think about somebody who's very, very good in terms of client management and client relationships. How would they approach it? Someone who's good at analyzing the problem, seeing it from the client's point of view, how would they view it? Someone who's very good at project management, what would they be doing at this stage? And someone who could just seem to sort of like walk through in an immense amount of chaos and destruction and still walk through with his client, still like him at the end of it. How would they approach it? So I think those are parts of what I've built through my career. In terms of some of the thinking, I think if you look at the work of Neil Cantle in particular, who now work with in regards to the risk and the systems, I think that's one of the best ways to build out. If you wanted to look at, I think there's a lot of good work that Chatham House are doing in regards to their climate accelerator, and would look at the work there. And then my sort of third, and I sort of, otherwise we'll be here all day, I suspect, but I point to Nicola Ranger and the work that she's been doing at Oxford in regards to, again, the nature and the impact of nature on the UK economy as a third element. Oh, very quickly, let me add Tim Lenton and Sandy Trust doing the work on tipping points at Exeter, and the new planetary solvency dashboard that they put out, which looks at climate, nature, the economy and society as a way of starting to think about all these different aspects together.
Brilliant resources there. And I think as you're listing these resources, many of whom some I've never heard of, some obviously are well known. It reminds me that we talked about the term flooding of the zone a lot. And many times in the context of maybe what the first few months of the new administration in the US. But I think there's probably been a bit of a flooding of the zone in the case of some sustainability work as well. And it's been difficult to find the gems, the truly insightful, well-researched academic pieces based on evidence, and separate that from some of the more sensational pieces. So thank you for highlighting these, and I'll hopefully be able to direct our listeners to them. And my last question is around pieces of advice, creed or motto, word of wisdom. I think we've known each other for probably about 20 years, and we've gone through many cycles. We've gone through cycles in the industry too. Anything that you can leave us with in terms of wisdom for a career or just life in general?
Yeah, and I think actually this is also included the sort of advice to the younger self. I think working out how to manage and embrace diversity. I mean, a little for myself and possibly a few others is being better able to sort of onboard criticism and alternative point of views. Without with sort of strong academic background, but I do like the A grades and feeling that I got everything right. So understanding that there are different perspectives, understanding actually that broadens and enriches the answer. It can be a slower process in terms of getting to the answer. So again, have a habit of leaping in and trying to think of what the answer is. But actually broadening that, building the consensus, and actually working together, embracing that diversity, that cognitive diversity, that heritage diversity, that perspective that is different, is something that the skills to manage that and embrace that and have everyone feel seen and included, I think is the most powerful thing that you can do in your world and approach. And, to sort of finish on a Steve Jobs note is, what I do is sort of like look to hire smart people around me because they'll make me look good. So again, I think that's a aspect in which it comes back to a sort of core job as consultant. Your job as a consultant is to make your client look good.
I love it. And actually, Steve Jobs is one of the main proponents, was one of the main proponents of complex thinking and loving complex problems. So I think it's particularly appropriate that we've referred back to him here, given our discussion of that earlier. Well, thank you so much, Nick. A conversation with you is always like attending a lecture. And I want to go take notes and research the sources because it's filled with tremendous amount of learning and commitment to keeping things clear as well. So I think we've achieved that here. Thank you for translating it into the way of system thinking, which we've only begun to discuss, I think, and also to bring it back to risk and impact. So thank you so much for coming here and sharing your insights with us.
Thanks, Evan. It's been great to catch up again. And hopefully that was a bit like a lecture in a good way. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. No, I happen to enjoy a good lecture. I'm Aoife David. Thank you for listening to the 50 Faces podcast. If you liked what you heard and would like to tune in to hearing more inspiring investors and their personal journeys, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be construed as investment advice, and all views are personal and should not be attributed to the organisations and affiliations of the host or any guest.